touched on that, so I won't belabor the point. One new GTL unit went online, commercial unit, in 2006. At least 2 more will be slated to go online in the next 5 years, and possibly more. And I would like to talk a little bit about the various products, the key products that are made from Fischer Tropsch units, and what impact they would have on the respective markets. And I will be talking in terms of supply, demand, quality issues in a global and regional scale and impacts. I could sort of generically sort of write down a product slate. These numbers are sort of for entertainment only, more than being real numbers. But if one had, let's say, a 50,000 barrel a day plant, you could say that typical products would fall, most of them, in the LPG, naphtha, diesel, lubes, and waxes range. If you don't do any hydrocracking, you would be, obviously, you always make a lot of diesel, but you would be making a lot of lubes and waxes. If you do have hydrocracking, very likely then you are going to make a lot of diesel, a lot of naphtha, less lubes and waxes. Table has some information about the goods and bads of all of these. And it's really the diesel, lubes, and waxes that I want to focus on. And in fact, let's start talking about the diesel, particularly about the quality of Fischer Tropsch diesel and the regulatory environment that is that will be playing inside. Fischer Tropsch diesel has been shown to be virtually sulfur-free, very low aromatics, less than, let's say, 5% PNA, very high cetane in the 70 to 80 range. And there are a number of regulations that are good for Fischer Tropsch and Fischer Tropsch units. I sort of classify them into 3 categories. One is regulations on alternative fuel content. There could be a regulation that says, for example, you have to put biofuels in your fuels. Or as concerns coal to liquids, for example, on Fischer Tropsch, we specifically have the Congressional Act of 2005, which says there is a 50 cent a gallon incentive for using United States-based coal to liquid fuels. This doesn't apply to coal to liquid fuels outside the United States at this point. Or there are regulations that sort of play with, in terms of benefits of Fischer Tropsch, such as fuel composition. These could include sulfur, aromatics, PNAs, and so forth. And as you're aware, there are a number of standards in these. They're tightening both for light and heavy duty diesel vehicles. These are expected to continue to tighten. For example, in the industrial world, let's say US, Western Europe, and Japan, sulfur in diesel is down to the range of 10 to 50 ppm. In the developing world, the numbers are higher, in the hundreds to 1,000, but they're also coming down. Current diesel in some countries is as much as, let's say, 5,000 ppm of sulfur, and so these numbers are coming down. So this is another class of regulations that, for which Fischer Tropsch diesel would be beneficial. And then when we come to emissions, again, there are a series of regulations having to do with emissions where are of interest. There are a number of studies as far as Fischer Tropsch diesels that demonstrate tailpipe emissions having benefits. These are a large number of studies, neat or in blends, compared with both conventional as well as reformulated diesel. There's a little bit of controversy about the interpretation of this data that you hear from time to time. But I personally haven't gotten to the bottom of it as to, as to those discussions. But to just give you a typical example of tailpipe emission results with Fischer Tropsch diesels, 40 to 50% reduction in hydrocarbons, one study showed 9% in NOx, 30% in particulates when compared with low sulfur refinery diesel. And people have seen benefits with both current engines as well as new engine technologies in Europe, again, either neat or in blends. The thing to notice is if you look at this from a well to wheel point of view, there isn't necessarily a great benefit to GTL. For example, you can look at CO2, you can add up all the CO2 that would be emitted, and the numbers are roughly the same. But what happens is when you use Fischer Tropsch diesel, instead of the CO2 coming out of the tailpipe, you're concentrating it in the plant, which has 2 benefits. 1, you move it away from the population centers. And 2, because it is at one location, now you have options of dealing with it, sequestration, and so on and so forth. A little bit more on the Fischer Tropsch diesel. The diesel is highly paraffinic. Because of that, the cetane numbers are quite high, in the 70 to 80 range. To give you a frame of reference, current specs in Europe and US are 50 and 45 respectively. So there's a lot of giveaway in terms of cetane. The Fischer Tropsch diesel typically have slightly lower density, which gives us a density premium, which is something we like. The flip side of that always is slightly lower fuel efficiency perceived. You can't have one without the other, really. A couple of minor problems: relatively poor cold start, low lubricity, but these are easily solved by blending, which pretty much we have to do anyway, and by using additives, and so no problems there. So people have looked at all of these sort of balance sheet of benefits and things that are not necessarily as good and what to do, and have done calculations in terms of the premium that a Fischer Tropsch diesel should bring. A large number of studies in the 90s show a premium of, let's say, 5 to 10 cents a gallon for FT diesel. More recent study, one by Baker and O'Brien for CTL diesel. They expect the price of it to be halfway between ultra-low sulfur diesel at US Gulf Coast and LA CARB. And when you look at the numbers, that ends up being about 120 to 130% of WTI. So there's definitely a benefit, a premium for this particular diesel. Then the other issue we need to talk about is the supply issue. How much Fischer Tropsch diesel are we likely to make? Where is the world market? And what issues there are? There are, if you were to follow this in the last 10 years, there are a large number of potential projects, but only a small fraction of them really will be built. And I'll touch on a handful of these. Qatar is sort of the self-described capital of GTL. Oryx 1 started up late 2006. Last month their upgrader went online, and they were saying next month they will have their first product lift. Shell Pearl is to come online in 2009. It's in construction. There are cost issues and ballooning costs, and we can certainly discuss that if you're interested. ExxonMobil had one which was to come online in Qatar in 2011, but they canceled it in February of 2007. That is last February. And then there are a number of other projects. There's one, Marathon, ConocoPhillips, sort of on hold for somewhat unrelated reasons for at least another couple of years. In Nigeria, Escravos is being built. They also have delays and cost issues, so we're not exactly sure of the date, but probably 2010, 2011 is the date. So people who have looked at the units that are being built, the ones that are under development, under study, under engineering, so on and so forth, to try to figure out really how much Fischer Tropsch diesel we are likely to add to the market. They have come up with some estimates. And just a couple of them I want to put in front of you. California Energy Commission a couple of years ago did a study, and they came up with 2010 with 75,000 barrels a day global new GTL capacity. 2015, about 400,000 barrels a day. 2020, about 800,000 barrels a day. Chevron Sasol a couple of years ago did some work, and they estimated that in the framework of 2016 to 2019, we should have about 600,000 barrels a day of new GTL capacity. And these numbers are roughly on line with each other. In terms of CTL diesel supply projections, this situation is really much less well-defined, because really the interest in CTL, this recent round of interest, came on a little after the interest in GTL. There are a number of potential locations. There's US, China, to a lesser extent Russia, Australia. Just talking about a couple of key countries. US, again, from Baker and O'Brien study, they project that by 2017 to 2022, 4 to 6 large-scale CTL units should be built in Western US. Large scale they define to be as over 40,000 barrels a day. And then they expect that some smaller plants would be built in the eastern United States. So when they look at the numbers, they look at the probabilities, they say that in the next 10, 15 years, we should have about 250,000 barrels of middle distillates from CTL in the United States. In China, there are a good number of projects under study. Just for an example, there's a 20,000 barrel plant in Inner Mongolia that's being worked on, among others. If you follow what the Chinese Communist Party is saying and the Chinese leaders are saying, basically now they consider CTL to be a key component of their overall long-term energy strategy. They seem to be pretty serious about that. However, in China, a new key issue has come up, and this is the recent environmental concerns of the government. If any of you who followed the Congress that was in session last month in Beijing, there were speech after speech and laws passed about environmental cleanup and regulations, and particularly big cities and plants and all of that. Sort of, if you're to be cynical, you just put this off as window dressing for the Olympics that are coming up, but really the expectation is as China becomes more prosperous, environmental issues become more key, and so that's a factor that is to be considered. So people have sort of looked at China, and one study by Robinson and Tatterson projected that within the next 15 years or so, we should have as much as, let's say, 160,000 barrels a day of liquid fuels in China from coal to liquids. So sort of this picture is not as well clear, but you can do a little bit of hand-wavy calculations, and you come up with an estimate of, by 2020, of somewhere between 300 and 500,000 barrels a day of CTL diesel coming up in the world. And wow, these colors are horrible. Well, then we really, if we are interested in the supply-demand picture, we need to look at where the world middle distillate is, where we are right now. And what I have here is a picture, a graph of middle distillate consumption, global. Full scale is from 0 to 30 million barrels a day over a period of 30 years, ending at 2005, which is the last year we have really good numbers for. This sort of divided in region: North America, Europe, Asia Pacific, the rest of the world. As you would expect, Asia Pacific has been expanding quite a bit. Right now, where we stand in terms of middle distillate consumption is at about 28 to 29 million barrels a day globally. All right. And this has, with all of the things that have been going on, this has been growing steadily at about 3% annually. About half of this middle distillates is actually automotive diesel. The other half is heating and number two and the like. So let's keep this number 28 to 29 million in our head, and I'll come back to it in a second. But people have sort of looked at it from a regional point of view. What's happening in Europe, trying to figure out what's happening in Europe, what's happening in America, what's happening in Asia Pacific, and each one has its own particulars. For example, in Europe, there's a lot of automotive diesel in use. As an example, 60% of cars in France and Austria already are using diesel fuel. All right, and in fact, there are all sorts of pushes to increase this number. So they have emission mandates, there are tax strategies, the car designs, there are technical things they're doing, improving diesel-powered car designs, increasing low-emission diesel fuel availability, and so forth. U.S., on the other hand, there's very little light diesel vehicle use in the market. About 4% of cars are run on diesel. And so in the U.S., the use of middle distillates and diesel range material is driven by the commercial sector. And so because of that, it's tied to the overall economy. And so it has a modest growth of about, let's say, 4 to 5% a year. However, there is regionality here. There are some states that are pushing. For example, California is coming up with all sorts of technical and legal ways of trying to increase the use of motor diesel. Asia Pacific, the growth is very rapid, but it's much more choppy than sort of the settled economies of Europe and US. China always is a huge factor. They've had a growth of about 8 to 10% a year, and it's expected to continue, and this is loosely correlated to diesel fuel usage. So globally, if you were to look at, for example, cars, about 30% of the cars in the world are diesel powered. People who have studied this and looked at what's coming online, technology, what's happening in terms of car technology, fuel technology, what the governments are doing, and so forth, they expect that within the next 10 years, this number to grow to about 40%, and then perhaps a partial replacement with hybrids. And again, overall, when you look at everything, the projection is that middle distillate demand will continue growing by about 3% a year. And so if you look at that, by 2020, we are looking at a demand of 44 million barrels a day of middle distillates, about half of that being automotive diesel. And of course, the big question is, where does Fischer Tropsch diesel fit into this? What sort of impact this is going to have? Just going to the next graph. This is exactly the same graph I had here, except I have added 15 years to the back end of it. So this is 28, 29 million barrels a day, and this is a projection of growth in demand of 3% a year. And so by 2020, demand is about, let's say, 44 million barrels a day. And so you say, where does Fischer Tropsch, where do Fischer Tropsch fit in this? Right here. Between years 2015 to 2020, if you add up everything I told you in terms of GTL and CTL diesel, we're talking maximum about 1 million barrels a day. All right. So it falls right here, depending on whether you're looking at middle distillates or automotive diesel. This is somewhere between 2 to 4% of the market. That's a good thing. That is, Fischer Tropsch are not likely to produce so much diesel that will be a huge chunk of the market, thereby upsetting the market and dropping the prices and getting rid of the premium. We always like that. We like to be a small part of this huge market. And so again, it's very unlikely to have a huge impact in terms of supply-demand in the global market. However, there can be potentially a large impact on the local markets. People have looked at this. For example, Shell estimates that one large GTL plant would fully satisfy the city of London, or 10 plants would satisfy PAT 5, which is a large area within the US. And in fact, using diesel as a blend stock for a small market, we can develop a good size critical mass. As an example, this is being done already. Shell in Thailand has been offering a grade of diesel called Pura, which is 30% Fischer Tropsch diesel from their Bintulu plant. Okay, and they've been doing this for, I don't know, 10, 15 years already. FT diesels are being sold as blend stocks in Greece and Germany and of course South Africa to a very large extent. CTL diesel could have, as these plants are built, could have a significant impact in the US region. Again, the Baker and O'Brien study suggests that as much as 20% of the demand for PAT 2, or the entire demand for PAT 4, which is a small usage region, if you will, could be satisfied by CTL. So in regional terms, this could be very significant. In terms of Asia and China, the picture is again a little murkier. It is entirely possible that as CTL units in China come on stream and start making diesel, they could relieve some of the pressure that exists in terms of price availability and particularly supply security in the Dubai, Singapore product and crude region. So what I think will happen, the scenario, is really it's very unlikely that pure Fischer Tropsch diesel will be used in any serious way, because that will require a separate infrastructure. Cars will need to be slightly modified, and that will take away the benefit of Fischer Tropsch diesel. And also, I don't think that Fischer Tropsch diesel will be used in a huge amount in jurisdictions with extremely tight specifications, because then the volumes of Fischer Tropsch diesel that we need will be huge. More likely, it will be used as a premium blend stock to bring somewhat off-spec diesel into compliance in many regions. And again, that's a good thing, because in that manner, it can actually capture its premium, its value a lot more easily. There is, of course, competition with this as people were developing GTL technology and CTL technology. The refining industry wasn't just sitting there. Many dozens of hydrotreaters have been built in refineries in the US, larger number outside. There have been great improvements in FCC, both in process, hardware, but especially in catalyst. in order to make cleaner diesel. Biofuels are, of course, there, the biggest one being ethanol, which are expected to grow in line with tax benefit mandates, but up to some level of availability for those. It's entirely possible that the sulfur premium for Fischer Tropsch diesel might erode, and in fact some people say the premium that Fischer Tropsch diesel would get us would ultimately, when the dust settles, might have less to do with sulfur and a lot more to do with this very high cetane number, which is quite valuable. Again, we're talking about a difference of 30 points or so. This would be really good for Europe because they have a higher cetane spec than in the United States. Slightly less good, if you will, for the US and for Asia. I want to, and I'm just trying to touch the highlights here because, of course, like all of these topics, this is a very, very large topic. So I want to switch gears and talk for a couple of minutes or a few minutes about Fischer Tropsch lubes. A little bit about quality, cost, again, supply, demand, market issues. Fischer Tropsch lubes are primarily produced when you take the FD waxes and isomerize them. Have really, really good quality parameters, if you will. Virtually no sulfur, no nitrogen, no aromatics, very narrow hydrocarbon distribution band, excellent oxidation stability, very good volatility and pour point, and most importantly, very high viscosity index, 140 plus, which is worth, frankly, a lot of money. And studies suggest pretty good economics for producing Fischer Tropsch lubes because in terms of manufacturing costs, they are similar to Group 1 and 2. And Group 1 and 2 are the older plants that actually make relatively lower quality lubes. So the manufacturing cost, if you will, is like Group 1 and 2. But the quality is similar to the high viscosity index groups, which are typically called 2 plus, 3, and 4.
Yeah.
Just to give you a couple of numbers on the overall lube market, the lube market is really small when we compare it with, let's say, the diesel market. Global lube market 2005, which is the last year we have really good numbers on, the entire market was 800,000 barrels a day. Compare this with diesel, where the diesel market is 28 million barrels a day. So really small. This is dominated by the lower quality ones, Group 1 and 2, about 95% of the market, and about 5% are the really high viscosity index ones. But these are the higher quality ones are expected to grow probably to over 10% by 2015, perhaps even more as automakers are retooling their engines and require higher quality lubricants. Overall, when you look at the lube market globally, things are steady, growing in a fairly steady fashion, but again, there is regionality. In the developing regions, particularly countries such as China and Brazil, demand is growing very fast. However, in the industrial countries, in fact, there's contraction going on. The demand is declining in US, Western Europe, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and so forth. So for example, in 2004, the growth was under 2%. In fact, in 2005, I don't have it up here, the growth was also slightly under 2%. And in fact, what is happening is lubes, the base stock lubes, are moving from North America and Western Europe into other regions. On the other hand, as I said in the previous slide, the demand for the high quality ones are going up, and they're expected to continue to go up. So what sort of impact Fischer Tropsch lubes can have in this market, which is the size of, let's say, the entire market is about 800,000 barrels. The high quality portion is only 5% of that. Well, one world scale Fischer Tropsch plant, let's say one plant that can make 100,000 barrels a day of total liquids, can make as much as 30,000 barrels a day of lube base stocks. All right. This is as much as 15% of the high quality group. All right. This is only one plant. So you can see that fairly easily, if we have a handful of plants and we actually choose to make lubricants, we can very easily overwhelm the market. I can give you other examples. ExxonMobil Qatar project, the one that was canceled, it would have been able theoretically to produce as much as 30,000 barrels a day of lube-based stocks. Some estimates say that by 2011, all the plants that are being built could possibly, and I'm underlining possibly, make as much as 20,000 barrels a day of lube-based stocks, or by 2020, as much as 200,000 barrels a day of lube-based stocks. As far as CTL lubes, again, because there's a lot more flux, we don't know the numbers, but I have stressed the word possibly, and I want to just say a word about that. The GTL economics in reality, and now I'm specifically talking about GTL, are primarily based on monetization of stranded gas in order to produce high-quality diesel. Okay. Historical Fischer Tropsch plants, like the one in Sasselburg and Segunda, make no lubes. And the question is, would anyone build a new plant to make really 20–30% lube? And the answer is no, not really, because everybody looks at the numbers we looked at right now, and they say, well, if I make one of these plants that makes 30,000 barrels a day of high-quality lube-based stock, it's going to absolutely destroy the market. And so in reality, what happens is all of the plants will include significant product cracking, so we'll be making much less lubes manufactured over the entire plant than is technically possible. And so likely scenario in terms of the impact is some Fischer Tropsch lubes will be made. These will trigger shutdown of the less efficient refinery lube capacity, and the key is the manufacturing costs. They are, if you sort of follow what's happening in lube refineries, they're in terms of the cost of manufacturing, they're all over the map. A lot of the older plants with older technologies really cost a lot more to make 1 barrel of lube or some such thing, and so these are the ones that would sort of get knocked off if Fischer Tropsch plants begin to make a certain amount of lubricants. Again, we are sort of speeding through these products. I want to shift to Fischer Tropsch waxes. A couple of words about quality. Unlike petroleum wax, which is a mix of iso and normal paraffins, FT wax is primarily linear in the C20 and plus range to 100 or wherever the end is. And this is really good for high melt applications. But if you have low melt applications, then basically you have to blend it down in order to get there. And in fact, all of the plants really, what they do is every plant, the current existing plants, make 2 grades of wax, 1 high melt, 1 low melt, and depending on what it is you're trying to make, you just blend it to make something intermediate. Fischer Tropsch plants actually have already been active for many, many years in the manufacture of waxes. The Bintulu plant and the Secunda plant already provide about 6% of the worldwide waxes. And these are high melt point waxes. On the other hand, the new plants that are to come online, Oryx, as well as the other ones that are announced, nobody's announced plans to sell waxy Fischer Tropsch material, either in crude form or finished form. However, if there's a tight wax market, this might create an opportunity within the industry. Just looking at the numbers, the global wax picture is, in terms of just the amount of product we're talking about, it's even smaller than the lubes picture. Okay. For example, in 2005, the total global wax capacity was about 11 billion pounds in the year. I'm sort of from refining background, so I like everything in barrels per day. So when you translate that to numbers we understand, that ends up being 100,000 barrels a day, which is really minuscule compared to the things we're used to. In fact, it's only about 13% of the base oil market. Most of the production is from petroleum sources, and as I mentioned before, about 6% now comes from GTL. And let me just skip this at this point. The thing about wax is, very rarely somebody sets out and says, I want to make wax. Most of the wax in the world is actually a byproduct of lube plants. Okay? So the fate of how much wax is made in the world is not in the hand of the people who want to make wax. If a lube refinery closes, gets rationalized, then the wax capacity goes with it. And so, for example, in the past few years, a number of Group 1 base oil plants have been rationalized and closed down in North America, Europe, and Asia. And so, of course, the wax goes out the door with that. The other interesting feature about wax production is it's really concentrated compared to the other parts of the industry we deal with. 75% of the wax in the world is made in 10 countries. Over a third of it in Asia, and in fact a total of 4 companies control more than half of the entire market. CNPC is one, ExxonMobil, Shell, and Sasol are the others. And if you were to sort of look at it regionally, a little more than a third is made in Asia, somewhat less than a third is made in North America, 18% in Europe, and smaller amounts in other regions. In terms of demand, essentially, if you sort of were to put this next to the supply picture, Asia's demand is about 23%, which is less than their supply. North America's demand is somewhat higher than their supply, and essentially what you find is refined wax is exported to North America. Just sort of interesting tidbit, about half of the wax in the world is food grade, and food grade is basically stuff that can touch food, or can be involved in food. The wax paper on your sandwich, or if you buy these cheeses that are wrapped in waxy things around them. So about half of the wax in the world is food grade. China is a very interesting picture. I'm not going to go through this entire thing, but China has been in great flux for a number of reasons, having to do with how the overall crude picture in China is changing. And the bottom line is China has been making gradually less wax and will continue to be making less wax, but also will be using more wax. And the bottom line is less Chinese wax will be available for export to North America and Europe. Of course, we don't know if China begins to build a number of coal-to-liquid plants, what effect that is going to have in terms of wax making. Will they choose to make some wax to make up for the losing wax capacity or not? So overall trends, when you sort of look at all of these different regions and what's happening, in fact, the wax market has had steady growth for the past 25 years, about 3% a year, although there is a fair bit of regionality, and also end products have been shifting. As an example, in China, most of the wax was going to make candles. As they become more industrial and they don't need as much candles or whatever, the uses are becoming more urbanized and fancier stuff, if you will, and that has an effect on things. Of course, so demand is going to grow, supply is going to come down, and this could be a very nice opportunity for GTL and CTL to contribute some wax into this market. One reason we like wax is, by the way, wax is worth a lot of money, a lot more than diesel or any other products, by half an order of magnitude or something like that. So the question is, what can Fischer Tropsch do to this? Well, again, because the wax market is so small, it is easily overwhelmed. For example, a single Fischer Tropsch plant, if they put their mind to it, they can make as much as 1 billion pounds a year of high-grade wax, which would be about 12% of the total global market. One analysis by Shell says that by 2015, Fischer Tropsch could potentially make as much as 4.4 billion pounds of wax. Another analysis by Klein says by roughly the same year, the world really needs only 1.5 billion pounds of wax. There's a threefold discrepancy here. So if the growth is at this rate in demand and we make this much more, we're going to absolutely destroy the wax market. And so in reality, what will happen is people will look at these numbers, and GTL and CTL plants that are coming online, they will deeply hydrocrack their wax range material into diesel and other lighter products to shove them into the bigger markets. So that will not have a huge effect. Probably about a third of that will be left to sell either as slag wax or make base oils. And then once you have that capacity, you can fine-tune it depending on the market need. So sort of to summarize this, a very commercially oriented talk, I suppose, is GTL and CTL are capable of producing very high quality diesel as well as lubes and waxes. In terms of the diesel market, they are unlikely to have a major impact on the global diesel market. It can be a nice positive component in making high quality blend stocks, if you will, and it can have a good impact in terms of local market supply and demand. On the other hand, in the lubes and waxes area, because those markets are so small and the capacities are so high, GTL or Fischer Tropsch lubes and waxes can have a significant effect on the worldwide pool. All right, so that's where the picture stands. I would like to thank some of my colleagues who have been very helpful. Amy Claxton of My Energy, Barbara Shook, reporter with Energy Intelligence Group, Dr. Carl Verbanek of Wax Data. Thank you for your attention. I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Any questions?
Yes, sir.
Can you talk a little bit about the impact of Fischer Tropsch naphtha on the ethylene industry?
Fischer Tropsch naphtha on the ethylene industry. The ethylene industry, again, and I haven't studied this myself in great detail, so I'm sort of hand-waving it. The ethylene industry, compared to the petroleum industry, again, is relatively small. All right. Fischer Tropsch, particularly if we hydrocrack, we could be making a lot of naphtha, which then, of course, could sort of feed into that industry to a certain extent. On the other hand, most of the naphtha that is made really will probably end up into the gasoline market. Okay. And because of that, I don't think, this is just my first guess at it, I don't think it's going to sort of overwhelm the ethylene market or push it in one direction in a great way or another. Yes, sir.
Several years back, someone, I believe it was at the spring meeting from Nigeria, stated that they passed a law that they weren't going to have any more, or they were going to greatly reduce their billion cubic feet a day flaring and venting of natural gas. And from what you say, this doesn't sound like it's likely to happen. But is there any move to, first of all, roughly how much natural gas do we vent and flare a day globally, do you know a number? And
yeah.
Is there any Fischer Tropsch or any other process available that may be able to go make some liquid out of it where it could be transported bulk-wise or stored or something? That just doesn't seem to be a good stewardship method
You're absolutely right in that. I think that the number I have in my head from I think 3 or 4 years ago was globally we were flaring 4 TCF of natural gas.
4
trillion cubic feet a year.
Okay.
So we have to divide it by 365
Yeah,
to
that's
see what
right.
it is. But it's a huge number. As it happens, of that, Nigeria, I believe, is more than half of the flaring. You know, the crudes that they produce, high gas production, and right now they have no way of doing anything with it. So they're literally, if you will, burning money or, doing all sorts of damage. This is a problem in many places. For example, Russians want to produce a number of crude oil fields deep in Siberia, but these crude oils are produced with natural gas, and they can't produce them because they don't know what to do with the natural gas. And this is a huge historical problem. If you read some of the old books about the oil industry, there's this great report from BP, I don't know, maybe 1920s or so, from southern Iran, where they were looking for oil. They had drilled a well, and they hadn't found oil, and so the report went back, which was, sorry, to London, sorry, we didn't find oil, but the good news is we didn't find natural gas either. It was just historically a problem, really. And I think this is part of the solution. I mean, there are all sorts of places in the world where we have stranded gas. Irresponsibly, certain places burn it, or in some other places it's just impacting the economy of a country because they choose not to do it. Anything you can do to take this natural gas, convert it to a liquid, which then can be much more cheaply transported, is good. This is one solution. And you see a lot of countries looking at that. Southeast Asians are looking at that, and Australians and Indonesians and all of that for this very reason. Nigerians are building it. I know there's that law for that very reason. And we'll just have to see where it all shakes out. There was another hand up.
Yes.
Shimon?
I think just to comment on your point, China is aggressively doing that too. I don't know whether you mentioned about China or not.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah, they're very much. Thanks.
Who's that? Yeah, in your slides, you mentioned ExxonMobil cancelled their capital development. Do you know why that was?
Well, the reasons are always complex, and when you deal with ExxonMobil, there's a little bit of reading of tea leaves going on. But essentially what's happened is, I have to sort of give you a little bit of history. A large amount of construction is going on in the Middle East, in the Persian Gulf region. LNGs, natural gas. If you open, hydrocarbon processing or oil and gas journal, they give you this construction index. Just go to any Middle East countries and you see there's a lot of construction going on, and this was primed from several years ago. And everything has come to a head in the past handful of years where there's not enough manpower, there are not enough companies, there are not enough facilities, and because of that, prices have gone up. An example of that is the Shell plant, where the original estimate was $6 billion, has gone up now the estimate to $18 billion. And from what I hear is ExxonMobil and the government of Qatar, they sort of got together and they did a little calculation, which is if we build now, that is going to do a lot of no good to our profitability, and so they decided to cancel it. I don't think it means they will never do it, but that's the main thing. Other comments, questions? Yes, sir.
So, given the kind of scales that you require to make a GTL process really economic, what's the motivation to really do GTL as opposed to LNG?
That's a really good question, and this has been debated, and in fact, you can sort of extend that. What is the motivation for GTL as opposed to making methanol and a number of other things? As it turns out, when you work the numbers, okay, if there are no anomalies like this weird, escalations and whatever, the profitabilities end up being fairly close to each other. Okay. One thing that is, if you will, bad for LNG is you spend several billions of dollars, okay, and you sort of put capital down on one end, capital down on the receiving country, build all these tankers, and on the other end, all you have is still methane, okay, which smaller market, and you have to do something with it, all right. The positive thing about GTL is you sort of put roughly the same amount of capital down. On the other end, you have diesel, which goes into a diesel, and I'm obviously simplifying diesel and a few other things. They go into a bigger market, higher value product, so in that sense, that's a motivation. The fight really in terms of whether to build LNG or GTL, part of it is fight over capital. That is, technologies are there and a number of these plants are there, and it's sort of bankers and insurance companies that are sort of sorting out, should we go GTL or should we go LNG? But on some other level, at government level, it's also a strategic issue. For example, Qatar has decided that we want both LNG and GTL, not to put all of our eggs in one basket.
So really an investment risk kind of analysis.
It really is. And when you talk about those numbers, ultimately it ends up being that.
Thank you very much. It was a very good market study.